Let's start with Japan's position in 1929. Unlike the industrial giants of the West, Japan was a relatively new player on the world stage. They'd only industrialized in the late 1800s, after centuries of isolation. By the 1922, they were exporting silk, textiles, and manufactured goods globally. Then the Depression hit, and it hit Japan hard. The 1929 stock market crash devastated global trade. Countries stopped buying Japanese exports, silk prices, Japan's biggest export collapsed by 50%, unemployment soared. Rural areas faced starvation. But Japan had an additional problem. They were on the gold standard. The gold standard meant Japan's currency, the yen, was tied to gold. For every yen in circulation, the Bank of Japan had to hold a certain amount of gold in reserve. This limited how much money they could create. When the Depression hit, countries on the gold standard couldn't simply print money to stimulate their economies. They were trapped. Britain, America, France, all stuck with deflationary policies that made the Depression worse. Most countries eventually abandoned the gold standard. Britain left in 1931, America in 1933, but the process was slow and politically difficult. Japan, however, did something different. In December 1931, Japan's finance minister Takahashi Korekiyo made a radical decision: abandon the gold standard immediately and devalue the yen aggressively. This wasn't a cautious, reluctant move. It was deliberate economic warfare. When Japan left the gold standard, the yen's value crashed exactly as Takahashi intended. Before abandoning gold, $1 equaled about 2 yen. After devaluation, $1 equaled nearly 4 yen. The yen lost half its value almost overnight. For ordinary Japanese citizens holding yen, this was a disaster. Their savings were suddenly worth half as much. Imported goods became twice as expensive. But for Japanese exporters, it was a gold mine. Suddenly, Japanese goods were incredibly cheap on the international market. A Japanese silk kimono that cost $20 before now cost $10. Japanese textiles undercut British and American competitors by 30–40%. Japan flooded global markets with cheap exports. While other countries were collapsing, Japan's export economy boomed. But Takahashi didn't stop there. He implemented massive deficit spending, government borrowing and spending to stimulate the economy. This was basically Keynesian economics before Keynes made it famous. The government pumped money into infrastructure projects: roads, bridges, ports, railways. Unemployment dropped as construction boomed. Factories reopened to meet export demand. But here's where the strategy gets darker. A huge portion of government spending went to the military. The Japanese Navy and Army received enormous budgets. Shipyards built warships. Factories produced weapons. The military expanded rapidly. Takahashi understood something critical. In a depression, it doesn't matter what you spend money on. Government spending stimulates demand regardless. Whether you build schools or battleships, workers get paid, and they spend money, which keeps the economy moving. He chose battleships. By 1932, Japan's economy was recovering, while the rest of the world suffered. Industrial production increased. Unemployment fell. GDP grew. The cost? Japan was becoming a militarized economy, and that military was looking for places to expand. Japan's devaluation strategy created international fury. British textile manufacturers watched Japanese competitors steal their markets. American farmers saw Japanese agricultural exports undercut their prices. European colonies in Asia faced Japanese economic dominance. Countries accused Japan of currency dumping, deliberately devaluing to gain unfair trade advantages. They weren't wrong. Britain and America tried to respond with tariffs, import taxes to make Japanese goods more expensive. But tariffs are slow and politically messy. By the time Western countries implemented protections, Japan had already captured huge market shares. Some countries tried competitive devaluation, lowering their own currencies to match Japan. This triggered a currency war, with nations racing to devalue faster than their competitors. The result was global trade chaos. International commerce broke down into competing currency blocks. The cooperative international system collapsed. Japan didn't care. They were winning. But currency manipulation alone doesn't explain Japan's recovery. The other critical factor was capital controls. The Japanese government tightly controlled money flowing in and out of the country. Foreign investment was restricted. Japanese companies were encouraged, sometimes forced to buy domestic rather than import. This created a closed economic system where Japanese money stayed in Japan, stimulating domestic industry rather than leaking overseas. Western economists called it protectionism and economic nationalism. Japan called it survival. And it worked. By 1936, Japan's industrial production was 40% higher than before the Depression. They'd not only recovered, they'd surged ahead. But economic success created new problems. Here's the dangerous part of Japan's strategy. The military became the primary engine of economic growth. Remember, Takahashi funded massive military expansion as economic stimulus. Shipyards, weapons factories, steel mills all serving military demand. This created powerful interest groups that depended on continued military spending. The Navy and Army became economic forces, not just military ones. The military also saw economic opportunity in expansion. Japan was resource poor. No oil, limited coal, little iron ore. Everything had to be imported. Military leaders argued, why import resources when we could conquer territories that have them? Manchuria had coal and iron. Southeast Asia had oil and rubber. China had everything Japan needed to become self-sufficient. Economic recovery gave Japan the industrial capacity to pursue military expansion, and military spending had become so central to the economy that the government couldn't stop even if they wanted to. Takahashi himself realized this. By 1935, he tried to reduce military budgets, warning that excessive military spending would cause inflation and destabilize the economy. In February 1936, junior military officers assassinated him during a coup attempt. The military effectively took control of economic policy. Instead of using economic growth for civilian prosperity, they channeled it into military expansion. In 1937, Japan invaded China. In 1941, they attacked Pearl Harbor. The economic strategy that pulled Japan out of the Depression ultimately fueled the Pacific War. So what can we learn from Japan's Depression strategy? First, the economics worked. Currency devaluation and deficit spending absolutely stimulated Japan's economy. While the world suffered, Japan recovered. The strategy succeeded economically. But economic success doesn't exist in a vacuum. The political and military consequences were catastrophic. By tying economic recovery to military expansion, Japan created a system that required continuous aggression to maintain. The economy became addicted to military spending. This is the danger of militarized Keynesianism using war preparation as economic stimulus. It works in the short term but creates interests that push toward actual war. Second, competitive devaluation destroys international cooperation. When countries manipulate currencies for advantage, trust breaks down. Trade becomes warfare by other means. The 1932 currency wars contributed to rising nationalism, protectionism, and ultimately military conflict. Economic competition became geopolitical rivalry. Third, Japan's strategy only worked because other countries stayed on the gold standard too long. Japan gained advantage by moving first and moving aggressively. If everyone devalues simultaneously, no one gains advantage. Japan's success was relative. They escaped depression faster than competitors. Finally, the question: could Japan have recovered without militarization? Probably. The devaluation and deficit spending would have worked regardless of what the government spent money on. They could have built schools, hospitals, infrastructure for civilian use. But politically, military spending was easier to justify. The military had political power. Civilian welfare didn't. Japan cheated the Great Depression through aggressive economic policy, currency devaluation, deficit spending, and capital controls. It was brilliant economics and strategic thinking. But economic recovery became militarization. Industrial growth became imperial expansion. And the strategy that saved Japan from depression ultimately led them into a catastrophic war they couldn't win. The lesson isn't that the economics were wrong. The lesson is that economic policy and political consequences are inseparable. Japan recovered from the Depression faster than anyone, but the cost of that recovery was millions of lives in the Pacific War. Economic success without political wisdom isn't success, it's deferred catastrophe. That's how Japan cheated the Great Depression, and that's why economic miracles always come with a price.